For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Diane Dimitrov, and I'm the Executive Director of LVAIC, and on behalf of LVAIC, as well as DeSales, welcome. And it's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker today is Jacqueline, or Jackie Askin, who is and has been the Senior Fellow for Finance and Campus Management at NACUBO, the National Association of College and University Business Officers. In this capacity, she's been leading something called the Economic Models Project, and she's going to talk to us about that today. Before joining NACUBO, Jackie was the Vice President of Administrative Services at the Chandler Gilbert Community College, and previously had served on Paradise Valley Community College, at the Arizona State University, and at the University of Arizona. She is a Lehigh University graduate, so welcome back to the Lehigh Valley. She also has degrees from Georgia Tech and the University of Iowa, and has her doctorate in higher education finance from the University of Arizona. So please join me in welcoming Jackie Askin as our speaker today.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving me some time this morning and for having me back in the Lehigh Valley. I don't get back very often, but certainly these are my old stomping grounds. And to my friend Craig, who heckles me every time I give this presentation, we are on a 4-year roll now, and we're looking forward to November of 2019. What I wanted to talk about, let's see if I can do this. Aha, okay. We titled the talk currently Sustaining, Thriving, Surviving, and Diving Institutions. I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by that rubric, and I'm actually going to move us a little bit away from Mark's great presentation that preceded me. Mark's presentation probably took us to about 1,000-foot level in terms of looking at higher education finance. I'm going to actually move you probably to a 5,000 or 10,000-foot level, and to a slightly different perspective, as you'll see as we go through. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are today as an industry. Then I'd like to talk about some of the assumptions that we developed as we went into the Economic Models Project at NACUBO. And then finally, talk a little bit about what that model is and how we hope that institutions can use it. This is a rubric that we came up with when we initially started the project about 3 or 4 years ago. And we're trying to define what we really expected of a thriving institution. What did we think a surviving institution was, and what was the diving institution? I'm not going to ask you this morning where you think you fall on that. We have asked in with other organizations and other presentations, but those have been a little more anonymous. I know you're sitting here with colleagues and peers. So while we are hoping that over the 3 years that we've been engaged with this project, and we know that many institutions have really been looking at not only our project, but some of the related work that's going on throughout the industry, we hope that the bell curve is moving more towards the left, that we have more institutions moving towards that thriving category. But just this week, we saw that Moody's again came out with an evaluation of higher education in general, and they see that while there's been movement of some institutions in the positive direction, there still remain many institutions that are too far to the right. Hopefully, though, we still maintain something of a bell curve on this. So just to give us a little bit of perspective of where we are today, these are headlines that I pulled from general circulation newspapers, as well as some of our industry press just from the last 2 months. We see headlines like, college may not be worth it anymore. That was an op-ed in the New York Times. Another closure, Marygrove, I think, was about the 8th or 9th institution to close so far as of mid-year this year. College enrollment declines. There's been a lot of talk this morning already about changing demographics. We're also, and while much of our attention here is focused on undergraduate enrollments, we also know that graduate enrollments are being challenged, particularly international graduate student. We've seen some mergers, although perhaps fewer than we expected. Many consider skipping college because of costs. Affordability is a significant issue. We've seen deep budget cuts, particularly for public institutions. The University of Alaska was contemplating, I think, a 20% budget cut. I saw a headline this morning that they may get a little bit of relief from that. Reorganizing away from liberal arts, we see institutions that are being pressured to move more towards disciplines and majors that appear to be more job-related. We see lots of leadership changes. Some of those quite understandable with the graying of some of our senior leadership, but some of those are coming about because of the churn within our institutions and the challenges that we're having within our institutions. Discount rates were alluded to earlier, record high this year on the NTSE study. So all of these things are kind of focusing on the dire side of things. So I have a question for you. Which side of this equation and what is your paradigm? Some of us believe that these headlines refer to other people, to other organizations. Yes, we saw Drexel, which was probably an institution not too far from here. But are we crying wolf? Is the situation really as dire as these headlines portray? Or are they indeed like the canaries in the coal mine? I know we're not too far from the coal regions, that are saying these are true threats and these are the future of our institutions if we don't act. So I'm curious, by a show of hands, how many of you think the situation is not as dire as those headlines that I randomly pulled from? Nobody. So everyone thinks that they are foreshadowing of where our institutions are today and where we're going. Is that, or we have no opinion? Yes. And you're in the middle. Okay. Well, and that's a reasonable place to be. There are certainly people, we're now, 11 years out from the recession. There are certainly still people in our industry who believe and say, or at least hope, that this is just a passing fad. It's just been an idiosyncratic thing. It's a normal part of our economic downturn, but we've always come out. We've had economic downturns throughout our histories. We've always come out of them just fine. The economy's doing well, right? Unemployment is down. Housing starts, at least where I live back in Arizona, are certainly significantly up. Endowment returns are up. The stock market, notwithstanding yesterday, you can see I made these slides up before yesterday. The stock market gain over the last decade has been the highest since the 19th century. We took advantage of a crisis. I know Mark alluded to this earlier. Are we taking advantage of the crises that occur to really make change in our organizations? Because sometimes it takes a crisis. We certainly did in 2008, 2009. We saw a lot of institutions that really took advantage of that and garnered efficiencies. We know there's an increasing need for an educated workforce. Employers are telling us that. And the other reason I think that those of us on campus, even those of us on campuses, may believe that it's just a passing issue is many of the organizational structures that we deal with, the budgets that we deal with, are not terribly transparent to us. I know CFOs are desperately trying to change that, but we have very complex organizations and budgets, and sometimes it's hard to see really what is happening on our campus alone. On the other hand, I think there's reason not to believe it's just another phase of our economy. We know that affordability is increasingly an issue and is increasingly being voiced. We hear about affordability even in the presidential campaign currently. Changing demographics, we'll talk more about that later, but I know those of you who have been attending this series of workshops have heard in depth about that. Just last week, the Gallup poll and Inside Higher Ed published their survey of business officers, and 47% of the CFOs, responding CFOs from private Bachelor of Arts colleges said that they are exceeding their normal spending policy on their endowments. We know that median family income has been stagnant. Public funding, perhaps more critical for public institutions, is increasingly being tied to performance and outcomes, and it's going to be increasingly challenged by the other needs of our states. We see increasing need for Medicare, Medicaid payments, we see infrastructure issues, et cetera. We have competition from new providers. The boot camps, the nano degrees, the badging programs. Changing patterns of philanthropy. We have some development people here, I think, advancement people. I don't know exactly what you're seeing. We certainly have been talking about the fact that millennials really are viewing philanthropy through different lenses than those of us who are somewhat older. They are, first of all, challenged perhaps by the student debt that they're taking on, and may see that repayment of that student debt is their philanthropy back to their institution, rightly or wrongly. They also see a need for impact of their funds, and so they're tending to be less driven by emotion and more interested in direct impact to constituencies that they care about. Just like the states are seeing competition for financial matters, our institutions are. We're seeing increasing costs of healthcare, retirement, deferred maintenance, talked about that a little bit earlier. And interestingly enough, I think this is an interesting and probably most poignant given yesterday's stock market situation. 61% of CBOs of private nonprofit colleges are worried about the impact of a future economic downturn. So while there are certainly reasons to be optimistic and hopeful about our institutions, we certainly have concerns. And that was really the impetus for the NACUBO deciding to undertake its economic models project 4 years ago. So as I said, we started the project, and we first of all had to say, okay, so what are our major premises? Well, obviously one of our major underlying premises was the future is not going to be the same as it has been. The world is changing around us and something needs to happen. So our first premise, sorry Mark, is that financial statements are not the economic model. Financial statements are not the business model of an institution. And I'm speaking as I am an accountant, so a little disappointing perhaps. Financial statements are after the fact statements about what's happened at our organization. They also are often on a synopsis basis that really don't tell us exactly why things are going on. They just tell us what happened on the dollars and cents. And so we changed our philosophy and said, it's not financial statements, it's not the sole responsibility of the finance office and the business office, it's economics. Economics, and my apologies to economics faculty in the room because I am not an economist, but are two things: the study of the production, investment, and consumption of resources, and also a study of supply and demand. So, who in this room has a position that involves recruiting or admitting students? Okay. Who's involved in developing curriculum or scheduling classes? Okay. Who's involved in fundraising or investment decisions? Some of those. Who participates in hiring and recruiting our faculty and staff? A number of people. Have anybody who manages facilities? Okay. Who did I miss? What other roles do we have in our institutions? Yes. Communications. Any other? Yes. Student services. Well, I would argue that all of your roles are involved in economics. You're certainly consuming resources individually, right? You're garnering salary, so that's pretty simple. But producing resources, investing resources, those of you who are recruiting students are dealing with the demand side of the equation. Those of you who are dealing with student services, academics, are dealing with the supply side of the equation. So everyone here has a role, and that was a real important premise for us to start with, recognizing that we, as NACUBO, as the Association of Business Officers, are not uniquely responsible and do not uniquely have the answers. So our second premise is that demand for higher education is changing. How many of you have been to the previous set workshops that LVAIC has had in spring? Okay, so several of you. So for those of you who have been, these premises are should be fairly familiar. You had Nicole Lloyd from Moravian talked about the Gen Z and the value of a degree back in early spring. In April, Nathan Graw came and talked about the changing demographics and the shifts in the college age population. And most recently in May, you had some folks from the American Talent Initiative come and talk about affordability and the issues of how are students going to be able to afford what one recent prognosticator said is soon going to be $100,000 a year tuition bill. So, if the demand side of the equation is changing, and if the fundamental rule is that we're playing by economics, not by accounting, then the supply side has to change. And so our premise is that colleges and universities must understand their models. So going back to the very beginning of my slides, whether you're surviving or diving or thriving, you need to understand your economic model, because go back to Jerry's comments earlier, the world is changing and it's going to continue to change all around us. So if we're going to be responsive to those changes, to those changing student needs and changing student expectations, we also need to be changing. So, 4 years ago, we said to institutions, okay, these are our premises. It's an economic issue. Everybody has to participate in the decision. Demand is changing, so we need to change. And everybody nodded their head, and they said, how many of you are changing? And a few hands went up. People said modestly. We said, so what are the impediments to change? And we had focus groups that included board members, faculty, business officers, student affairs folks, provosts. This is a Wordle of their responses. You're familiar with Wordle, you know that the size of the word differentiates the frequency of response. Obviously I think we had maybe a strong bias in our focus groups inadvertently towards public institutions, and that's probably why divestment came up as large as it did. But I'm curious, if you are answering that question today, are there things that surprise you? Are there answers that you think are missing or that are more important today than they may have appeared even 3 or 4 years ago? I would agree with you. Any others that surprise you? Yes?
I think one of the biggest things that's missed, these are all change when significant factors go against higher education and really should cause operational changes. We make 4-year commitments to students coming in as freshmen, and they don't care that you're not making a class second year or third year, but you have that commitment that you have to maintain. As opposed to corporate America with manufacturing, they live by the quarter or live by the 6 months, they can make adjustments much more rapidly. Higher education is a much more difficult ship to steer when factors go against it.
Right, so we have to have a much more longitudinal framework and an understanding of the longer term consequences. Yes?
So demographics is a tiny word.
Yeah.
But in fact, this country has way too many colleges. That's part of the challenge of higher education is that it's not as much of a crisis as I think we sometimes look at. It's a crisis for individual institutions.
Institutions are certainly hoping away some of this. Another person, we did part of our focus groups were online, and this was a comment we got back from a VP of enrollment. We're limited by the ungodly combination of honoring tradition and unrealistic ambition. This is higher ed's affliction. So, thought those two kind of captured some things. So, but again, okay, that's all well and good. We've identified problems. We need to work to solutions. So what do the solutions look like? Well, first you need a model or a framework, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But first I want to go through very quickly this slide, which we've identified as things to move forward, necessary but not necessarily sufficient conditions. And I would argue that they really deal with culture and governance and leadership issues that need to be changing in our institutions. So first, people say we need a stable, aligned leadership with vision. Well, stable leadership is a real challenge. I don't know how long most of your leaders have been around. Currently in higher ed, the average tenure for a president, I think, is 6 years, maybe, and shrinking. In the community college world that I came from, it was below 3 years. John Cotter from Harvard Business School tells us it takes 7 years for an idea truly to be implemented. Well, if you have leadership that is changing far more rapidly than that, it's going to be very hard to maintain that. Secondly, involve everyone, as I said before. This is an economics issue. This is not simply a business office issue. In addition, we have lots of really, really smart people on our campuses. We are extremely fortunate. My husband has been a faculty member for 40 plus years. He is extremely frustrated when the business office or some other leader on campus goes out and hires a consultant to do data analysis. He's an industrial engineer. He knows it as well as anybody. He would love to be engaged and participate, and I've heard many faculty say similar things. Trust your constituents. Share the brutal facts. Now, it sounds to me from talking with a number of your business officers in the last 24 hours that that really is happening on your campuses. But we know that there are campuses out there that are trying to shield their constituents, whether it's their students or their staff and faculty, or they're trying to avoid ugly press that may be forthcoming if they share those facts. But it needs to be shared. People need to really have transparency as to what the institution, where the institution is and where it's going. Third, this should be probably pretty straightforward. Focus on strategy and innovation. We have seen institutions that will make an across-the-board budget cut for a one-year endeavor. Not long-term, not strategic. Again, look to the long term. Short-term fixes are not necessarily going to abate the problem. Utilize data. This is probably a growing enterprise at many of our institutions. We're finally moving from iPad's descriptive data to much more predictive analytics to help us understand our students, where they're going, what they want, and what they need from us. Learn from peers. Share solutions. one of the interesting factoids that Larry Ladd shared with us was that he was dealing with a number of truly distressed institutions. And he said, the thing that's really interesting about these is when I go and meet the president and the CFO and the provost, these people are not participating in their national organizations. They have no idea what solutions are out there and what their peers are doing. So I give you many kudos for participating with this organization and with your other organizations. And finally, and what's perhaps the toughest thing for us as higher education folks, is to make those tough decisions and take action. We are really good at mulling things over. We have something of, I think, a culture and modality of wanting to really come up with the perfect answer. We had a discussion at dinner last night. Said, faculty members on research, you want the answer, the perfect answer, so that you can publish, garner resources. Our world is moving too fast. We need to make decisions, and we need to take action. So, here's our economic framework. I think we started out with a misnomer. We were titled the Economic Models Project before we got our feet on the ground. And model, what does model mean to you? If I say, use the word model, what is it? There's an equation, there's a heuristic, there's a spreadsheet, there's a checklist. Follow this. And as we moved forward, we very quickly realized there's no silver bullet for this. And there's no one answer that will fit every institution. As was alluded to earlier, we have lots of institutions. We have about 4,400, 4,300 accredited institutions of higher education in the United States. There is no single solution that's going to work for everyone. So we've developed a project. Those of you who haven't had a chance, much more detail is on our website, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. Excuse me. As we move forward, we also realized that there was lots of critique. The very first paper we wrote is what is higher ed, what is the situation with higher education and how did we get here? So we did lots of research and read lots of critiques of the higher education business model. But nobody defined it for us. Nobody told us. It was like, well, everybody's criticizing it because of the outcome and the results, but nobody's really taken a look at what really constitutes a business model or an economic model of a higher education institution. Fortunately, some of our colleagues in private industry have done some of that research. And so we adapted that and said there are really 4 major segments of our institution that comprise our economic model. First and foremost is mission. The other are structure, strengths, and resources. We feel that it's really important to start with mission. You need to know who you are. And I will tell you, it's unlikely, I think, that your mission is your mission statement. At least many of the mission statements we've looked at are easily transferable between institutions. We're really looking at a much more deep and reflective type of questions. And so our economic models project really has evolved to an economic framework, 4 parts, and within each part, we've developed questions that we think institutions should be asking of themselves to get a better understanding of each component. Some questions will not apply across the board. There are questions about research programs, obviously don't apply to community colleges. There are questions about religious affiliation, which apply to some institutions and not others. So we would say, what is your fundamental purpose? What excites your constituents? How are you unique? What communities do you serve? And what outcomes will you produce? That's your mission. Again, if you go to the website, you will see a couple of dozen additional questions broken down into component parts. Under mission, we have a series of questions about constituents, a series of questions about market, and so forth. And so I would encourage you to take a look at those and identify which ones might be most applicable to your institution. We've also tried to identify institutions that are doing really well, or at least making some adaptations. So we see institutions that are adapting or expanding their missions. We find institutions that are finding their niche and identifying new constituents. And if this will work, let's see if I can do this. Nope. There we go.
Maybe there's an irony in business officers bringing us back to what we're actually about, to think about where we are, who we are, and not just be so many institutions trying to imitate what this place over here is doing and what that place over there is doing, but to really look for distinctive, strategic niches and places of comparative advantage. Almost all institutions operate in an ecology that is highly, highly competitive. And I remember one of the conversations on the task force, one of the presidents said, I mapped out within my region, there's 130 plus institutions competing with us. So what are we doing that is distinctive? What is it about our model and our mission that is distinctive?
Gary was a member of our advisory committee. We were really privileged to have a great group of folks, and as you heard him say, I think it's a tough environment here. Obviously, 6 institutions within a very proximate area. This particular university that he was talking about in Southern California had 132 within a fairly narrow geographic scope. Then we look at structure. And by structure, we're talking about organizational structure, governance structure, decision-making structures. We're talking about internal structures and external structures. How are you organized to make decisions? Are you a centralized organization or decentralized? Do you have policies and procedures? I heard that word around tables earlier. Do the policies and procedures support your mission? Are you willing to undertake strategic risks? And again, we find institutions that are doing that. Collaborations, partnerships, mergers. I don't think there's a single institution I've met that isn't engaged in some sort of external collaboration and partnership. We see new models of leadership. We see new sites, brick and mortar sites, as well as virtual sites, some local, some at a distance. Arizona State University is opening a new campus in Los Angeles, which, best of my knowledge, is not part of Arizona, called Arizona ASU Local. It will start next week. Is a hybrid campus. We see institutions outsourcing so that they can focus on their core enterprises. Third area, what are your strengths? Which is really for us a pseudonym for what are your programs and services. What are you doing that you are best at to be competitive? How do your strengths play to what's happening in the rest of the world? And how are you maintaining and improving those programs? Again, we see institutions adopting new pedagogy, adopting new curriculum. We said last night, there's hardly a week that goes by that there isn't an article in Inside Higher Ed that lists all the new programs at all the institutions. So certainly a plethora of new curricula. On the other hand, we also see institutions focusing on the core. And we see adopting new credentialing models. There's an institution in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota at Rochester, that has adopted a program. Their focus is health science, not surprising since they're adjacent to the Mayo Clinic. And they are enforcing their first 2 years of their students' life on campus is as a cohort in a common curriculum. So it's very efficient from an instructional perspective, but it also creates cohorts of students who are able to do significant peer-to-peer learning. And, oops, let's see if I can do this one. This is Danielle Rippich. Danielle is the President Emerita of the University of New England, and she talks a little briefly about how she came in, how she saw the strengths of her institution, and how she endeavored to help the institution leverage.
When I first came to UNE, they described themselves as a little school in the woods of Maine, and they could be insular. They could not see themselves beyond what they were. We had 3 colleges: College of Osteopathic Medicine, College of Arts and Sciences, and a Health Professions College. And I could see so much more for this university. I could see it growing, and there was in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, it was the largest geographic area in the U.S. without a dental school, without a pharmacy school. And so with the basic science we had in medicine, I saw us as becoming this kind of an institution for Northern New England. But how do I get people to see that? So in The Little Prince, there's a quote. It's something like, if you want to build a ship, don't set people about the task of gathering wood and pounding nails. Teach them to long for the immensity of the sea. And I looked out on the rocky coast of Maine and the Atlantic, and I was reading a lot about New England, reading Emerson and Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. And in A Passage to India, he has the line, "Go boldly forward, sail for the deep water only." And that I used in my inaugural address, and it resonated with Mainers.
So you see, she helped the institution see that they had great strengths in the health-related professions and identified opportunities then to optimize the institution to take advantage of those. The last quadrant is resources. There are a couple of reasons that we put resources at the end. First, many of our audiences are chief business officers who immediately want to talk about dollars and cents, and we wanted to set that aside. We think it's really important that all of us take a holistic view of the institution. We also realize that resources need to be deployed to support mission, structure, and our program and service strengths. But we do have a series of questions. How do we allocate them? Are we allocating our resources to support our strengths? We're also talking about not only dollars and cents, we're talking about human resources. So how are we attracting, retaining, and deploying our human resources? We're also talking about capital resources. How are we utilizing our structures, our buildings, our equipment effectively? And perhaps a new resource that we've just recently added is data. And how are we progressing in using data resources to analyze problems, predict outcomes, and prescribe solutions? Again, beneath each of these on the website are a series of many more questions. We're seeing institutions making those changes. We're doing program prioritization. We're looking at new sources of revenue and alternative revenues and leveraging old ones through redeployment. New pricing strategies. I heard earlier that Elizabethtown College has done a tuition reset. I know a number of other institutions have as well. Not advocating that. I think the research is out on the consequences. We're seeing new budgetary incentives through RCM, changes in how we use data. We're also looking at new faculty roles, organizational structures. So in sum, this is the model that we came up with. We believe framework. There are obviously overlaps between and among the 4 domains. And I think it's important as you answer the questions to recognize the interactive effects between them. We recognize that there are ripple effects of our decisions as well. Dan Greenstein, who I think is now the Chancellor of Higher Education in the state of Pennsylvania, recently said, "Every choice we make has a consequence," and I would append to that, and so does the failure to make a choice and the failure to act. What is most critical is that we begin to have these conversations across our campuses and move to action. This is not going to be a one and done exercise either. It's an exercise that needs to continue as the world changes, whether it becomes a part of your budgetary process, your accreditation processes, perhaps, your strategic planning processes. These conversations need to happen. And with that, it's probably time for me to turn to your colleagues and ask them to talk about how some of this applies at your institutions. So, you want to bring the panel up? A close-knit group, yeah. The names are up on the screen, but I'm going to invite them each to quickly introduce themselves. Alan, do you want to start? Alan's our technology guy.
Okay, Alan Chen, I'm the Chief Information Officer at Muhlenberg College.
Amy Scott, Associate Professor of Business at DeSales. I teach economics and finance.
Annette Diorio, Vice President for Campus Life at Lafayette College.
Doug Mahoney, Chair of the Faculty Senate at Lehigh University and member of the Management Faculty.
Audra Carr, I'm the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer at Cedar Crest College.
Okay. All right. Well, we talked throughout the morning about everyone having a contribution to the discussion. So I'd like to invite Annette, maybe if you'll start, talk about what and how you contribute to these discussions, and how do you work in relationship with the other folks that are on this panel and perhaps other roles at your institution.
Thank you, and thank you for having us. So my role really is about students, but let me tell you how I think of students, and let me tell you how that role fits in. I think of our students as people who have not yet been born to people who are actually dying, who are alumni of our institution, the whole spectrum. So for me, I believe what I do for my colleagues and at my institution is to help think about the student experience, what draws students to a college, what keeps them there, and then what helps them give back after they graduate, and how their experience on campus helps them not only be successful in their chosen fields and to move on, but to think about their 4 years, or depending on your institution, how long they're there, that time as something that they want to give back. So for me, how we do that is I may be translating current research, I may be telling folks about information that we've gathered, data that we're using, and how I do that, I see my president sitting here and she knows I've said this, I walk on average at work about 6 miles a day. So I tend to actually drop in on people. And it might be sending someone an article, it might be saying, hey, this is a trend we're seeing in what students are asking for, what students are doing. I may be responding to faculty members asking me, we're seeing this in the classroom, how do we help to prepare our faculty better? So I think it's really a synthesis of all of that information. So all the folks I work with, I ask questions about what will this mean for our students on campus, what will this mean for future generations of students, how does this affect our alumni? The most challenging thing we face right now is helping our alumni who are so committed to the college understand that their experience in 1969 is actually not what students are experiencing in 2019, and how we sort of convey that to stay current, to stay strong, we need to constantly be changing a little bit. That is something that we all work on together.
Doug, what about a faculty's perspective?
Sure, thank you. So I have I was thinking about my role. I'm physically now and kind of positioned at Lehigh as being in the middle. And that is, so I'm the leader of the Senate, and our Senate is brand new, it's a year in. But in that role, I'm tasked with representing the faculty to the senior administration. And so I'm neither a faculty member nor a member of the senior administration, although I am on their senior leadership team. And so I'm positioned there. And my role I see is kind of complex in that sense that I need to translate kind of faculty concerns and over issues. A lot of times it gets lost in the noise. We had an issue around parking that a lot of faculty went up in arms about, quite rightly on a number of issues and quite wrongly on others. And so in dealing with, I was looking at you, but our CFO, who's not Audra, but you could be Pat. Yeah, it's one of the many Pats on campus. Was really holding them accountable and saying, well, here's what the faculty are voicing their concerns about, without the hysterics that some faculty were going up in arms about the unknown. And so I see that as part of my role, is just translating. I see it as being someone that the administration can turn to when they need to gut check something or inquire. And the other role I see, and this came up in some of the presentations, and that is the tenure of leadership. It's 4 years, 4.5 years. I made this remark publicly, and John Simon quite openly challenged me and said he's planning on staying longer than 4.5 years. But their tenure typically is around 4 to 5 years. That's the same with provosts, same with deans. And in that 4 to 5 years, their time horizon is really short. They want to make an impact, some of them, and then move on to a new position. And so sometimes their individual desires and goals may not be aligned with the institution's long-term desires and goals. Whereas the students, they're also there for 4 years. And as very much to Annette's point, their mindset is locked. From that point forward, this is what university life is like. But the faculty are there typically much longer. And so we have a longer time horizon. And we have a vested interest in the long-term success of the institution. So I see our role going forward as expressing and kind of holding leadership accountable for their decisions that they want to make and the implications of the decisions that they do make.
Alan, what does IT do in this regard?
I think one thing you're hearing from so far, and I think you'll hear from all of us, is just kind of a duality of our roles. So strictly from the IT domain, obviously I'm concerned for everything from very dry topics like servers and networking and help desks and stuff, but also how does all of that affect the teaching, learning, and work of the institution? So it's always in that context. So yes, we have to make sure there's a Blu-ray player in the classroom, but what does that mean in terms of the faculty members' ability to work with media in the classroom, for instance? I think at the same time, on the duality I was talking about is on a larger scale, we all have a responsibility to contribute both from our own personal perspectives, but also as a member of senior cabinet or whatever role we're playing, we have a role to contribute holistically to the institution's health. And we have that responsibility as well.
Okay. The next question, we talk about the kinds of information and data. I've talked a little bit about the changing role of data in our institutions. Audra, what kinds of information and data do you need to understand the issues at Cedar Crest?
So those in the room that know me know I'm a very analytical, strategic, responsibility generating kind of person. So data is critically important to me as I make decisions on our campus or work with others across campus. I have relationships with folks on campus that provide me data that may help me think about things differently. It may be a little bit more streamlined on our campus at Cedar Crest because we're smaller. We don't have as many silos. We used to have many silos. Now we've broken down those barriers that cause us not to communicate and cross-collaborate. So it's easy for me to walk, maybe not 6 miles, Annette, but maybe, two, some steps, but walk to somebody or call somebody and ask them for information and talk about what I'm thinking about. Ask them what the challenges they're facing are. Help them see what I'm thinking about and then move forward. But we need data. So the cabinet, the officers of at the administration of your institution need data to make good decisions. That doesn't mean we're only going to rely on that data. We're not going to just solely sit there and say, well, the data says X and we're going to do Y. Because as Mark said, data is history, right? It's not what we're seeing moving forward. So sometimes from an administrative perspective, it's a gut check. It's what we're feeling in our guts that we need to do based upon the information we have, the conversations, the things that are out in the future, the strategy we're trying to look forward to, reminding ourselves that the strategic plan that we all generated together is our guide moving forward, right? So we look at data, but then we think about the strategic plan and how that's moving our institution forward. So sometimes it's not only the physical contextual data like the enrollment, because I look at the enrollment stuff all the time. I know I have one of our enrollment folks in the room today, and she knows we're in those meetings and I'm asking questions and I know the financial pieces of it. Sometimes it's not financial, right? The numbers just give us a guide, but you have to know that data to make good decisions. And so I always think that when we're asking questions about data, we kind of hunker down in our areas and we like, that's my data. Don't challenge my data because I did that. And you know it's right. And it's right. But we have to ask each other questions without that barrier. And I think what we do in all of our areas is we kind of control our area so much so that it can be prohibitive. And it can't allow us to move forward because we try so respectfully to defend our information. But what that information is a guide. It's not the gospel. And so I encourage, my folks that work around me and work with me, they know it's not the answer. I'm not looking for the answer. I'm looking for information to help guide my decision making. And I think at Cedar Crest, we really try to do that. We try to bring some folks in. But there's a slew of data across everyone's area. But sometimes what we do is we kind of protect our data. And I think that that's one of the barriers that I see and that it's hard to break. It's hard to break because I get defensive about my own data too. But thinking about that, and it was interesting because we were talking about that last night about how defensive we get about information and making decisions and talking to each other because we have that siloed effect in higher education. And we have to let that go because our conversations with our faculty, our conversations with the folks in student affairs, the conversations with institutional advancement really guide what we do moving forward. And if we can't have those conversations without being defensive, we're going to be stagnant, and we're going to go into that diving category instead of the thriving category.
Amy?
So I'm the only one on here who doesn't have a dual role because I am straight faculty, but I'm actually going to answer this question two ways because I'm faculty in two different ways. The first way I'll answer it is the general faculty member. If you were just a general faculty member, sometimes you might feel like you don't have any idea where this information is coming from and how these people are making these decisions and all that kind of stuff. And then the second part of that is that I'm also the faculty member that sat on the Budget Advisory Committee, the Finance and Budget of the Board of Trustees, so I am privy to data when I'm on those committees. I will say that we try at DeSales to do a really nice job of getting that data out to people. Of a faculty member, we have open meetings, open budget, open doors, all that kind of stuff so that you do understand when people are making decisions that they are, they to your point, they've thought about these numbers. Anytime I ask a question, I know for sure that Bob's already thought of it. So I don't mean to question Bob or Mike or anybody. I'm sure they thought about it already, but I need to understand for myself, where that's coming from. So I think really you have the data and you're making those decisions, but I really think the transparency and the communication of that and making people feel that they have a say or a buy-in or whatever is really kind of how we can get rid of some of those things. I kind of maybe jumped around on that, but I think the data exists. We are groups of smart people at these schools. We know how to crunch a number or two. It's there, and I think you try to get it out to people, and I think people want to see it and understand how these decisions are made.
So I won't replicate what my colleagues have said here, but I will say that one of the things that is difficult when we talk about being data-driven and we talk about this is that some of our decisions, despite the data, are actually couched in an inefficiency. We are agreeing that there's an inefficiency that is valuable, so we are going to say, well, we're looking at these data, and this suggests that there would be a more efficient way to do this, but we are actually choosing to do it in the inefficient way, which I think confuses sometimes the general population. Because I'm like, well, if you're talking about being data-driven, then you probably should use the data to make the more efficient decision. And when we choose not to, I think it undermines sometimes folks' trust in our ability to use data appropriately. So I think, and I certainly try, and others do, to be really clear about why we're seeking information, what we're planning to do with it, and how we expect that to influence a final decision. But I think folks' understanding of how you use data and what you use and what the logical decision should be if you have the information can mix that up. The only other thing that I would say about data is that we are not doing, by and large, double-blind scientific studies, and so I do think sometimes in speaking with faculty, there is a little bit of, you took this information that wasn't really in a scientific method, how is that valid, when really we were just trying to get a sense of how people thought about a program. Like it wasn't meant to be published, and I think there's a little bit of, constant having to revisit that and saying like, well, this is how we were using the information, understanding the rigor that you use in your discipline, not saying that's not valid, it's really valid for what you're doing with that work. We're not actually looking to publish this, we're really just looking to know if we should expand the dining hall hours. So that's, I think those things are important.
Okay. One of the domains of the NACUBO economic model is strengths, and where we talk about strengths, when, as parents, we tell our kids to play to your strengths. As colleagues, we tell our colleagues and staff, play to your strengths. So we want our institutions to do likewise. What roles do you play in garnering understanding across your campuses of what those strengths might be and how to move those forward? Anyone?
Okay, I'll start. So from the IT perspective, I think to a certain extent, so IT, I speak very generically here across a lot of institutions. Because it is so costly, both from an operating model, software, for instance, as well as a capital model, servers, networking, et cetera, can sometimes be seen as purely a cost center, which is very understandable. So the question becomes, how do we make IT a strength for an institution? How do we make it more effective and more powerful for the institution? I gave the example earlier of a Blu-ray player being about media teaching in the classroom. I think that we have to find a way to, from the IT perspective, we have to find a way to show that we can be a strength to an institution, that we can be a factor for the outcomes of that institution for the students. The larger scale is how do IT might not be the strength for the institution, however. We play a significant role. We play a role both academically, both teaching and learning, the social side. Sometimes the Wi-Fi is used for streaming media in the class, in the residences. That's the social side of IT. We talk about the work that we do. But there are many different strengths, and the roles that we play at the table here are that we have to think about all the different strengths and of an institution and how we can best play to those.
I will say, as faculty, I kind of feel we're on the front lines a little bit because we're in the classroom. We're the ones talking to the students that we've, brought on this campus, and we have this commitment to because, you're paying us a lot of money to be here, and you're paying. They don't care about us, really. They care about the gym and the dining hall. Not that their faculty are well published or anything like that, but I think that sometimes some of the things that comes out of the classroom the students are, they keep us young, they keep us fresh, and the ideas that they have sometimes turn into things that we've implemented. So I think as faculty, you need to listen and communicate to our most important, I don't want to say the most important people on campus, but to some pretty special people, and that would be our students.
So I'm going to talk for 1 second about my field. So as a discipline, student affairs isn't all that old, 50, 60, 75 years, whatever you want to choose. And I think we have, in some ways, done ourselves a disservice in that we have positioned ourselves as competing with faculty, with the classroom. We're saying like, well, what we do is just as important, and people are learning outside the classroom and all these things. And that is true, and that is certainly true for all of us in this school who are residential colleges, and being residential is part of that, an integral part of that mission. But I think what we can do best is think about the ways that we complement each other and talk about students' experiences holistically and thinking about, there are ways that students are applying what they're doing in the classroom. And when I can feed that information back to faculty members, I can say, like, I was meeting with a student and they talked about this project that they're working on with you. That helps us to solidify that partnership and to think about, we are a business, I don't like to say it, we're business. We are producing graduates who are needing to succeed in a global economy that is changing rapidly. That's what we're producing. And so everything that contributes to that success, how we tell that and how we package that is really important. And so the more we can talk about the way we each contribute to that outcome, to what we're looking for at the end of those 4 years, the stronger that message gets. When we get a little turfy, and sometimes we do, places like, well, what I'm doing is really important, and no, what I'm doing is really important, it serves no one at the institution and certainly doesn't serve our students. So the more we can break that down by talking about where we align what the work we're doing. Oh,
It's because we're from Leah. Did I say that out loud? Is this on? Sorry. So this is a great question, and Lehigh's undergoing a lot of transition, a lot of change, push towards more research-focused path to prominence. I'm still not sure what that means. However, a lot of faculty, particularly faculty that have been there for 10 years or more, firmly believe that our strength was our connection and relationship with our students. And they're feeling like that's being threatened and challenged quite directly. And so part of my role this year in particular, as we search for a new provost, is to put that emphasis back, and because I think it's been lost in the shuffle of pushing towards research focus. So we've gone out and recruited a lot of faculty that are really research active, and we have deans, I won't name the two in particular, who have openly said, I don't care about teaching. And we're getting people promoted whose teaching may not be where we would like it to be, given that our strength was producing high caliber students in a rich learning environment. And so one example is to remind leadership that this was and is our strength, and it's not a contradiction or has to occur at the expense of research focus as well. So it's, again, kind of utilizing my role as my bully pulpit to be a thorn in individuals' sides and express those kinds of opinions.
So I think I'm very fortunate. I get to work at a place that I refer to as Cheers, where everybody knows your name, right? We don't drink all the time, but you think about it, it's so small that we know each other, right? And so we communicate with each other on a regular basis. And we all know what each other is working on. We all know their pressure points. Enrollment, when we're doing admissions events, most of the place is there. The faculty are there in droves. Our admissions folks are there. Our student affairs professionals are there. And they're selling the college. They know each other's role enough to talk about what they're doing. And that's something called communication. We don't communicate enough in higher education. So we have to get to a space where we're able to talk freely and easily about other areas. And my perspective is that everybody needs to understand the mission, not just the words of the mission statement. Anybody can memorize that and recite that. But what truly is your mission statement saying? What does that mean for your institution? What does that mean for the professionals that work in specific areas? And how does that then translate to your students? Because no matter what, we are all part of recruitment. We are all part of retention. We are all part of persistence. It doesn't matter what your role is. And the finance folks who sit here can easily say, we're here for the numbers. Everything kind of rolls downhill, and if we don't get the numbers, our budgets are challenged. But at the end of the day, mission equals margin. It's the bottom line. And if everybody can't speak that mission in a way that translates to students of today and the students of tomorrow, we're not going to effectively be in a good position. So how it's for you is going to mean understanding what that mission translates at your home institution, and not just the words, the true meaning. And that comes from everyone.
Great. You've talked a lot about the involvement of students in terms of helping you to identify strengths and opportunities. Talk to me a little bit, or talk to all of us, a little bit about how you work with your communities. Obviously, you have some overlapping communities. I think you probably also have some different communities that you interact with. How do those communities advise you, support you, and provide you with information about directions that you might be taking?
Okay, I'll take this first. I'll narrow my focus. I don't know. Is that better? There you go. Sorry. I'll narrow my focus to what a lot of us are experiencing, and that is reaching out to non-traditional students, at least for us, right? And what that means for our campus community. And what we hear and what we see, or what our eyes are open to, if we're open to them, are a lot of students that come to campus. They're recruited heavily. They provide the nice broad depth of experience and background that we're seeking is in our student body, but we're not prepared for them, and we're not prepared to provide them the experience that they need to thrive and succeed. And so as faculty members, and on our role in the Senate, we work with the student senate and the student leadership, both at the graduate and the undergraduate level, work with student affairs leadership as well, and others on campus to try to ensure that we're doing enough to embrace and ensure that, that when we bring these valuable students to the campus, that we're doing everything we can to ensure that their experience is positive and enabling them to be successful. And so it's talking to our students, it's opening our doors. One thing, we have actually just retired, George White led initiative the last couple of years for first-gen students and non-traditional students. A number of us will have a sticker on our door that says, "Come talk to me. I'll be happy to chat with you." And it's a way of translating and gathering that information and moving it up to the organization, saying, here's what's going on in the minds of young people today. They may look like they're doing okay, but they're in stress and distress. And here's what we think we need, whether it's providing warm clothes for them, because they can get here, but then they can't afford to feed themselves, or they can't afford to buy a coat if they're coming from the west or the southwest. So that's one area.
You know, when I think about communities, I think multiple different areas. So you have your internal communities, which is all of us and everybody back at your home campus. But then there's the external community too, right? And those external community members help you also think about what you can be doing on your campus, or where the needs might be. And as Doug said, you know, on our campus at Cedar Crest, we're thinking about the external community a lot too, because those are potential folks that, being on our campus, they might not know about it, they might never have been. So bringing on other things that focus on generating traffic to our area makes it possible for others. So we think Mayfair Festival of the Arts, we brought that on solely to have people know about Cedar Crest and where it is, just to have a good time. I can't tell you how many people said, I didn't even know this was here, or I lived right across the creek and I've never been here. But part of that is just engaging them in what we have in a learning community. That then generates enrollment in our Institute and Learning Retirement. That generates folks going to our pool and swimming there because it's a community-centric pool. That brings people to our library. That brings activity to a campus, right? And I think that a lot of times in higher education, we're only focusing on our internal community. But there's far more greater things to look at as you think about how to broaden your campus, because think about graduate education. That's the wave we all need to be thinking about. That's where there's growth. Where are you going to get them from? It might be from your undergraduate population. It's probably not going to be. So you have to be engaging folks to come to your campus and do different things. And I know a lot of us are doing that in different ways, but you have to really think about that differently, because in order to expand, people have to know who you are. And a billboard is not going to just do that for you. So I get it. I see all the billboards coming down, but they don't know them. They know us. They know the campuses that represent LVAIC. And being part of that community, whether it be in work that we do as on boards, is important. You should all think about being on boards somewhere within your community. It's very simple to participate, but it's getting your name out there, it's getting the college out there, and it's also letting you give somebody else your knowledge. And what they remember is maybe not your name, but that you came from Cedar Crest, from Lehigh, Lafayette, and you name it, right? And that's important for us. And as an administrator, I tell all my folks, if you have time to be on a board, you have time to volunteer, do it. Do it for yourself, but do it to give back to the community, because they're going to be who we're looking to support us long term.
I think it's always tough being one of the later ones to go answering a question, because you kind of want to say, I agree with everything everyone said before. And I think the perspectives offered have been really great. So I'm actually going to purposely zero in on my own domain of IT. In general, I like to think of myself merely as part of the senior staff at Muhlenberg. So I don't always zero in on IT, but I'm going to do that now purposely. Opportunities and risks have been a really big topic. Risks in particular has been a really big topic in IT over the last couple of years. A lot of regulations, a lot of security risks, stuff like that. And so we're bringing that to the table. And many times we are bringing that from the external community of people, other higher ed institutions around the country. We're trying to bring that to the table for conversation, for opportunities for us to grow, for us to improve, not just to become compliant, but to perhaps be leaders in the space, to be ahead of the curve, to be moving faster than what is merely being required of us by regulation. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to be working with outside communities, with the community also internally as the institution to break down the barriers that maybe, even at smaller institutions like ours, there's always going to be some, I don't use the word silos, but there's going to be some, different areas where we are focused in our own zone. That's why we have collaborative meetings like senior staff, cabinet, et cetera, is so that we can hear about the different things we're doing in our zones. And by looking at the different opportunities and risks, whether it's IT specific, whether it's student affairs, whether it's CFO, these are all important ways for us to work outside of our zones and to identify the different opportunities.
Okay, we've been talking about external communities and students and how they inform our decisions. I'm going to ask you to be a little self-reflective now and talk about what are the structures and issues on your campus that inhibit your ability to move forward on some of these areas, or that enabled you to. And what is one thing that you would change, if you could, to enable these conversations to go forward?
I think I'm up first on this one, so this time I get to lead the way. I think that the ways that we can really start with some new opportunities, and I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this question. The ways that we can start with new opportunities and that we can grow in terms of the ways that we work together. The IT-specific areas are that the challenges we have, again, I mentioned earlier that IT is a very expensive space. It's very easy and understandable, and I want to be clear about that. It's understandable for us to say, well, it's going to cost $500,000 to upgrade that infrastructure that's lasted 4 years. Well, we can make it last a fifth year, and speaking even from my own space, it's understandable for that to be a decision made. We just extend the warranty, et cetera, and we just make it work. That is not always the best way to go about things, obviously. And the challenge there in terms of the competing priorities is that how do we make sure that technology as a space and as an impact that cuts across the entire institution, how do we make sure that technology and IT that affects so many different people, how do we make sure that it is having that positive impact on the institution? When there are competing priorities, the conversation has to be a holistic conversation where I can present my case, others can present their cases, and we can all come to an understanding that yes, sometimes my own domain, IT, it has to give 1 year. Hopefully it'll be a priority for the following year. That's where the collaboration and the communication really takes impact.
Talking about structure, I mean, from a faculty side, we are committee driven, right? So we get to be put on or elected to, depending on if you ducked fast enough or not, or you really wanted to be on a committee. So I guess, and I'll take it more of at DeSales, I think we really try to give knowledge, or, pass it out, information, be open, be transparent, have meetings on numbers, and have people understand. I guess for, we have a structure as far as you have to be on a certain committee in order to be on the next committee, so that you enter in from the one budget committee, the budget advisory, to the board of trustees committee, right? So it makes sense that you have that experience before you get on there. I guess just advice to faculty, if you're out there, we've talked about silos. We are probably the worst offenders of the silos sometimes. We sit in our offices and crunch our little numbers and talk to our students, and we don't always cross campus or go to lunch or talk to somebody in another division. So I think we're probably some of the people that are most guilty of that. So I guess I'm going to say this, understanding that every single first faculty person in the room has been asked to do more with less. Like every single member of a university committee, we've all been asked to do more with less for the last years, and we're just like, where is it going to come from? I don't have any time because, our roles have all changed, and we're all, trying to keep up and make it all happen. But if you can operate within those structures, volunteer for committees, or get on committees, or go to open meetings, get out of your little room when you're crunching your numbers. I think that really is probably the best way. And then if you're the actual committee member, you have to turn around and give that information. So it's not just enough for me to be on that committee. I have to turn around and give that to my division and announce it in a faculty meeting so that the information gets passed along. It's great that I know because I sat on the Finance and Budget of the Board Committee, but that's not great that not everybody knows. So that operating within the existing structure, and obviously if you can see change and communicate.
Yeah, I would second actually the academic calendar sometimes doesn't line up with other decision-making processes, so that's something we have to sort of get our heads around. Faculty committees meet typically during the academic year, not during the summer. We're actually trying to make a lot of decisions during the summer. So I think sometimes we run afoul of our culture unintentionally by trying to be responsive and move changes forward without, thinking, okay, well, we actually have to have 2 years to have this conversation because we need a whole year of it to go through faculty committees and then a whole year of moving through the other structures. The thing that I would say for Lafayette, which has been interesting, is, and I see this in my own area, is that we tend to be, you understand the structure of my division when you look at it. You're like, here's a net, here's a dean, here's a dean. When we look at the faculty, it isn't really as clear. Like I'm often having to explain to my staff, department head in psychology is not the same as a department head in recreation services. So what you think this person might be able to offer you, they may not be able to. It's not the same kind of structure. And for particularly when we're bringing staff in from outside of higher education to work, it's sometimes a director level, having been their first experience in higher education. The structure, which isn't always obvious, some of it is lacks a little transparency in how things are coupled on both ends. That can be something that I think is pretty challenging for folks to figure out how to make a decision, because they thought they involved the right people, and then they come to the end and it's like, but you didn't ask these 6 people, and they're like, how was I supposed to know to ask those people? So I think that's something that as an entire sector we grapple with. It can really vary from institution to institution. I was actually a little bit surprised. I was in graduate school at the University of Kansas before I came here, and I was a little bit surprised that it was actually clearer at a large institution how you navigated the structure than it was at a small institution. Figured it out quickly, but not everyone does. So,
I don't know. So yeah, I was thinking about inhibitors and enablers of successful participation, and one thing occurred to me, and that is the quickest way for a faculty member to become dead to their colleagues is to, other than the big M maturing, is to go to the dark side of administration. Yeah, I've been accused of a few things. But what I mean by that is we have this us-them mentality, and for a lot of the members of administration, they were faculty for most of their career, and that doesn't change. Their mindset still stays that way. They just have to think it in a different perspective. But so this us-them mindset is problematic, and it's on both sides of the equation, right? So I've got senior administrators that don't want to trust faculty with information because they'll just spew it here and spew it there, and they won't understand it. I've got faculty that will look at anything coming from senior leadership with utter disdain and distrust because they're just out to screw them, pardon the expression. So it's really, how do we challenge the presumptions and biases that we both have of each other and recognize that we all work for the same institution and we all ultimately want the institution to thrive. So that's one big inhibitor, is getting past that bias. The second one, and I'll square this on my colleagues on the faculty side of the house, and that is engagement. Faculty, by and large, are not engaged in the university life, except for when it matters to them personally or as individuals. And so how do we get faculty to see themselves and their relationships to their institution beyond just the transactional? Meaning, I've got a lab here, or I've got an office here, and access to data, access to technology that'll help my research, and oh yeah, I'll teach for an hour and a half once a day, twice a week, to really thinking about, well, it matters the decisions that we make at this institution. It matters, do we decide to go with a private-public partnership to build our next dorm, or do we keep it all in-house? And think about these issues. It matters what kinds of classes we're admitting, and it matters to me as a faculty member. So getting them to be more engaged is, I think it's a losing battle, and I'll probably die before it occurs. But that's one big inhibitor. The one enabler, and I'll leave this on a positive note, and this is, and that is, at least at Lehigh, for the last several years I've been part of the senior leadership team, now as my role as chair of the Senate, but my prior role as well. And that's given me kind of face time with individuals. I know Alice and Amir met out here, and you were commenting about, wow, meeting at conferences, doing business, right? But it's those minutes in between the real time where you're meeting that a lot can get done. So if I've got an issue that I know the faculty is concerned about, and I'm sitting next to the head of LTS, I can just say, hey, Bruce, here's something on my mind. Or I can go meet with our head of research or associate provost. Or I can say quite quietly to the president, there's several concerns about X, and then we'll get together and meet. So it's having those informal opportunities, or taking those informal opportunities to really build relationships so that you can walk in the door and get things done. So I'll leave that.
That's great. I'm glad you took that one. I would say the elephant in the room, right? The elephant in the room is what most people are going to say, well, we can't do X because we don't have resources. The budget's tight. Or I always get no, right? And I hear that when I first started at Cedar Crest, I heard that a lot. You're just going to say no, Audra. Why would I come talk to you if you're going to tell me no? I can't even tell you that. That was my first foray into, higher education, and I came from industry. And I think there's benefits to having people come in from industry, from a pace perspective, from a fresh look. There's a lot of benefits in that. But I'm going to challenge my fellow CFOs in the room, right? I'm going to challenge you to not use the word no. As your first word. You didn't let me finish, Mark. Not no as your first word. You may be thinking it. You may, in your head, be listening to them, and it's going over in your head, no, 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 no. I can't believe they're telling me this. No, no, no. But listen. Listen to whoever's bringing you that idea. Because there are competing priorities within the organization that you work. And maybe it's not that one that you're going to pick, or it's another one. But wait, sit on it. Think for 48, 72 hours about it. And it still may be no at the end. Still may be no, because it's not right for the niche program that you're looking for. You may not want to roll out something that 132 other colleges have. But what's positive in that is there is conversation happening. There's idea generation. And you're going to need that person that came to you, that you said you're going to say no to, or you did say no to. You're going to need them to come up with another idea. And you don't want to stunt that possibility. So in my first 5 years at Cedar Crest, I had to try to stop saying no. My first inclination was no. Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But what I did think about was, well, no to that, but could we do this? And together we thought of a new idea or a new possibility, or it's still the same thing they presented, I just changed it a little bit. Maybe we didn't add 3 people, maybe we added 1.5. Or maybe we didn't need a new building, but we could put it in another room. Or maybe it was the IT piece of equipment that we needed for $500,000 that we thought differently about, right? And so people, I think from my perspective now, 10 years into this, and 15 at Cedar Crest, has been, what if I said no all those times? Would we have a strategic plan? Would we have new programs? Would we have people thinking about different things or coming to talk to me and just talking? Because that's sometimes where the idea generation happens, just in a conversation, where you're having coffee together or you're looking at something like, that's not right. Can we do something different there? Some of that has to remain. And I think everybody on campuses say, the CFO is going to say no, so I'm not even going to go there. So you don't want to stop that from happening, because the CFO might actually say yes. And if they didn't try to come talk to you, then the opportunity is lost, and we might be behind because of it. Some of the greatest ideas we've done at Cedar Crest were because faculty came to talk to me. And I'm super proud of it. But if they didn't, or they didn't feel comfortable talking to me, we wouldn't have done it. We wouldn't have done it. So that's my challenge to the CFOs in the room, and they're gonna. I'll bring you full food at our next meeting, because I know they're gonna give me the stank eye for the rest of the day.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to echo you, Audra. When I first started my CFO stints, I think I was in the same boat of always feeling like I was. And then I realized that it wasn't the outcome that we necessarily disagreed about, it was the means. And so if we could listen through to the outcome and agree on an outcome and then negotiate the means, we got a lot done. So I would definitely support that. I've been hogging, do we have time for 1 or 2 questions? Yes, I've been hogging the question role. Do we have any questions out in the audience? I know we're between you and lunch now, but questions for the panel, or Mark?
So I just want to rebound from my no, because that was like a CFO mic drop moment, what you said. I really appreciated that. And one of the things that my boss has challenged us with, this is Dr. Grigsby at Moravian, is don't say no, tell me what I have to do to say yes, which is an interesting way to approach that, which I think speaks to what you said, Jackie, is what are the means required to get there. And it really does change your way of thinking, and it forces you to think it through, to take the 48 hours. So that was really a great moment. And if, I know I'll remember that, and I just wanted to share that sort of additional thought as it relates to, tell me what I need to do to get done, don't just say no.
One more question? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, our focus was on the U.S.
Is there anything that we can learn from other countries? How they eliminated that mismatching skill demand in the marketplace? American universities are not dynamic enough to meet the demand of the market. Is there anything that we can learn from Germany, or from Japan, or from Italy, that is doing something that we can learn from them?
I am not an expert on higher education internationally. I will tell you, probably not from Germany, not from Europe. They're very traditional systems, more tradition-bound than we have been, and we're an offshoot of the German model of higher education. I think it would be interesting to look at some of the new universities that are popping up more in Asia. Look at Korea, look at Singapore. Again, I don't know specifics about how they're moving programmatically. I know a little bit about some of the U.S. institutions that are based there. But I would also suggest not just looking at higher education. Look at some of the other industries around us. Healthcare delivery is changing dramatically. Obviously, we can't just take something from healthcare and just plop it into higher education, but it may inspire us to think about some things differently. Obviously, retail marketing is changing dramatically. Even for us on campuses, how we go about our research programs if we're a faculty member, or our instructional programs in terms of looking for resources for students. We don't walk to the library, pull a journal off a shelf anymore, right? Go onto our computer in our office, and we're pulling it up off of JSTOR or one of the other data sets. So look at those things for inspiration, not for modeling necessarily. Anything else?
How many in the room have been taught by Dr. Hojak? I got more.
Okay.
I don't know if I did so hot, but I passed. That was a hard class.
All right. Any other questions? Then will you help me thank our panel for the